warm welcome to all the participants in today's webinar. This is our 14th webinar in our talk series. And I see a lot of familiar faces, so we won't, I won't tell you more about Ritambara, but as you know, Ritambara is a wellness company that looks at wellness in a holistic way. We have for you today, Shri Krishnapani Kesiraju, our program director, who's talking to us on a subject, a philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, myth or reality. It's a very intriguing subject, so we're all eager to hear what Shri Krishnapani ji has to say on it. So the program will follow this format, 30 to 40 minutes of talk, and then it will be followed by 15 to 20 minutes of question and answer that will be moderated by Shri Krishnapani ji himself. You will all be muted through the talk, so please maintain that decorum because we are recording this session. Feel free to post your questions on the chat function that you see at the bottom of your screen, and Krishnapani ji will go through them one by one. In case you want to ask your question, you can do that after he finishes all the questions on the chat function. You can do that. Unmute yourself. Please ask the question and then mute yourself again. Thank you so much, and we welcome Shri Krishnapani ji. Over to you, Shri Krishnapani ji.
Thank you so much, Beena ji. Am I audible?
Yes. Very.
Okay, thank you. A very warm welcome to all the participants. This particular subject I have selected because quite some time back, maybe about 5 or 6 years back, when I was taking down some notes, I came across this and I thought this is a very interesting subject which we need to understand at a deeper level. Before I go to the subject proper, that is the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, myth and reality, I would like to dwell for a few minutes on what exactly is a myth. You know, one of the dictionary meanings of the word myth is that it is a widely held but false belief or idea. But there are several other meanings. It also means a usually traditional story of ostensibly historical events that serve to unfold part of the worldview of a people, of a particular civilization or a particular culture, and they try to explain a practice, a belief, or a natural phenomenon, or something like that. We have several myths. We have, and it is very important to have myths also. I'll come to that later. But generally what happens is whenever we use the word myth, there seems to be a negative connotation in our mind as some kind of a misconception or a fallacy or some kind of a fantasy people hold on, as though something it is something which is imaginary and unverifiable. But then it is generally said that if a large number of people for a long time over generations believe in it, it becomes a very powerful and enduring substratum for a society. These myths have a very strong hold on the society. In fact, several other issues grow from this myth, which is a common belief held by a large number of people over a long period of time. So it becomes a part of the tradition, it becomes a part of the culture. And here, the truth of it doesn't matter, actually. More important is, what is the inspiration? What is the meaning it conveys to the group is what really matters. In fact, these myths and legends are created constantly. We have several of these myths. That means some small incident which might have happened somewhere is elaborated, and then they give a different coloring to it, and they make it as a some kind of a heroic effort on the part of somebody. I remember one or two of these things where during the freedom struggle, several of these leaders uh, went to jail and were beaten up by the police of the British regime. And then there were several issues with this. In a particular case, some innocent boy was held, and a very famous lawyer went and got him released. In fact, the person who was there at that time, he told me that this kind of event had happened. But over a period of time, the myth that developed over it is that this man went and accosted the policemen who were about to fire him with their, those old kind of rifles, and he had bared his chest, and then he said, "Okay, I am ready to die for the cause, and you fire at me," kind of thing. So a small event can be, built up as a story for inspiration. So in fact, myths are that way very important, and it gives a lot of inspiration to a whole culture, to a whole society. And two of such myths, I'm going to talk about two of such myths. In fact, generally both these are clubbed together when they are discussed: the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life. What exactly is this philosopher's stone? This philosopher's stone is said to be an alchemical substance which turns base metals such as lead or mercury into gold or silver. This is the meaning of what generally is referred to as the philosopher's stone. Sometimes it is also called as the elixir of life, but in a different context, when they say that this elixir of life is something which is useful for rejuvenation and for achieving some kind of immortality. And almost all cultures and civilizations have this idea of having some potion, some kind of a drink, by drinking which people will become young and remain young forever. See, one of the myths that originates on account of this is that the Devas were the one who had taken the Amrita, or the elixir, or what is called as ambrosia. And the myth also says that they don't age beyond 30. So Devas don't age beyond 30, and therefore one of the synonyms for Devas is Tridasha. Tridasha means 3/10. 3/10 is 30. So they remain at the age of 30, and then they don't age beyond that. When I was discussing this with a few doctors, medical professionals, they revealed a very interesting thing, that generally a human being, there is growth in some form or the other up to the age of 30. Beyond 30, there is no growth. There will be a slow process of declining from 30 onwards. So this 30 has is a significant number that way, and that is why it is attributed to the Devas. That means they grow up to that age, and their growth stops, and they don't age beyond that. There is no question of further decay. So this is considered to be on account of their drinking what is called as Amrita, or the elixir of life, which makes them permanently young. And it confers something called as immortality. See, I came across another interesting thing when I was doing some research on this topic. I think most of us are familiar with the word called magnum opus. The actual meaning of this Latin term is the great work. The effort to discover this philosopher's stone or the elixir of life, it seems is called as the magnum opus. Magnum opus means a great work. And what is that great work? That the work of research and finding out this philosopher's stone and the elixir of life. Now, very interestingly, actually people across civilizations for say at least 2 to 3 millennia have been spending their lifetime. They have spent their entire life. They spent all their resources. They spent time and effort and resources, everything were put to discover or to find out this philosopher's stone or the elixir of life. They were obsessed with it. The medieval alchemists were obsessed with it, and they were literally trying to find out, actually physically discover this philosopher's stone. So it was a kind of a very sought after goal during the lifetimes of maybe thousands of people across the cultures. They were very desperate. Vastly differing geographical areas, dispersed over vast distances, they still had this common goal. They still had this common goal of discovering or trying to somehow get hold of this philosopher's stone or the elixir of life. So they have actually sacrificed their lives to find out about this. In a way, if you see, this kind of effort or this kind of what is called as the magnum opus is continuing even today. Lot of research is going on, especially when we see when medical professionals and technologists and computer scientists, they're all trying to artificially create human organs. Recently, there was an article which mentioned that after 2050, death is optional. They said death is going to be optional. Nobody need to die because we are going to have technology by which we can not only create human organs, but we can substantially eliminate all the sources of chronic and life-threatening diseases by tweaking the DNA, by tweaking the chromosomes, by treatment, now people are storing the placenta or the umbilical cord. When a child is born, the umbilical cord is, a part of it is frozen and stored, and because they say that it has all the stem cells, the stem cell research and all. So this kind of research actually, it is going on, and they are very hopeful that they can postpone death indefinitely. They can postpone death indefinitely. So there are, even today, using technology, very serious attempts are being made, and billions of dollars are being spent trying to imitate and replicate mental processes. What we are talking about, machine learning and artificial intelligence, all these things. See, this is in a way equivalent to the search for the philosopher's stone or the elixir of life. This is what is happening. Some of the science fiction writers who use substantial background of scientific developments and scientific research and create a fictional story out of it, they have also done this kind of research where they say that most of the present day scientific discoveries or technological innovations which we see, they are actually rooted in myths. They are rooted in the legends and belief systems and myths of a culture. And in a way, they say it is very important to sustain these myths. Because as I mentioned earlier, whether it is true or not is not of much importance. What is of importance is how many people believe in it. And how long they have been believing this. For how long they have been brought over this kind of, their entire bringing up is with these stories and myths, and they continue to believe it to be true. So it is important in a way to sustain the myths because, as I mentioned, they give a great inspiration and an impetus to actions. If these myths were not there, most of the efforts which, technological efforts that are being made, they would have been abandoned at the initial stage itself. They would have simply abandoned it as though as if it's not possible, or it is a kind of a ludicrous idea with which people need not waste time. But that's not true. They have actually rooted most of these scientific discoveries in that. And very interestingly, what happens is, whenever you are pursuing some dream, whether it's a scientific dream or a technological dream or something or the other, what is important is that when you are in search of something, the law of nature says you will find something or the other. You may not actually find the philosopher's stone, but you may find something else which may be useful. So all great technological efforts will have lot of spin-off technologies. Generally, it is said that the efforts of organizations like NASA or ISRO or those who are almost on the frontiers of science, they get a lot of spin-off technologies. In fact, the mobile technology is said to be a spin-off of one of the developments during the 1969 moon landing. The effort that was made for about 10 years, a lot of spin-off technologies have come about, and some of these are not yet to be commercialized. But one of the most important thing which we find today, which is almost indispensable to all of us, is the mobile telephony. This particular technology was known to NASA in the late 60s or early 70s. And they didn't give much importance to it. They were just using it for their internal communication purposes, only for talking. They released it as a commercial technology only in the 90s. Why I am saying this is, all these things were sustained by the kind of dreams those scientists and technologists had, which were again rooted in some kind of a belief system, some kind of a legend or a myth. And I would like to, dwell for a few minutes on what Yuval Noah Harari, the famous author of the book called Sapiens, which was subsequently followed by two more books called the Homo Deus, and the third one is the 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. All are very interesting books by this gentleman who is an Israeli professor of history. This is actually, one is about the history of mankind, humankind, and the other is the history of the future, he says. And he talks about several of these things. And one important aspect which he talks about is the what we call as the myths. Now he talks about three kinds of revolution. First is what he calls as the cognitive revolution. The second is the agricultural revolution, and the third is called as the scientific revolution. We are not concerned with the agricultural and scientific revolutions, but he says the first revolution that happened in the evolution of humankind is the cognitive revolution, which happened about 60, 70,000 years ago, according to him. We are not very much concerned about the chronology or the time period during which it happened. But what is important, he says, is that this cognitive revolution is the appearance of new ways of thinking and communication, which might have happened between 70,000 and 30,000 years ago. He talks about the genetic mutations that changed the inner wiring of the brains of the sapiens, enabling them to think in unprecedented ways and to communicate using an altogether new type of language. He further states that our language, the humans, which across nations and across civilizations, the human language is amazingly supple because we can connect a limited number of sounds and signs to produce an infinite number of sentences, each with a distinct meaning. A lot of scientific research has been done where they find that there are modes of communication between animals, between birds, and all that. But what is unique about human beings is that they use a limited number of sounds, which are actually what we have what we call as the alphabet of a particular language, and we can create infinite number of sentences which have a distinct meaning. Each sentence has a distinct meaning. Then he says one of the theories, he says, agrees that our unique language evolved as a means of sharing information about the world. Our language evolved as a way of gossiping. Normally, the gossip is considered to be something not very civilized or not very good. But people, even today, he says, we indulge in gossip only. This gossip theory, he says, might appear as a joke, but numerous studies have supported this. And even today, the vast majority of human communication, whether in the form of emails or phone calls or SMSs or newspaper columns, it is still gossip only. We talk about people, we talk about events, we talk about issues with which we may not be directly concerned, but it comes so naturally to us, and it appears as though language was actually discovered for the purpose of gossip only. So, rumor mongering. Now, a lot of laws are being brought in to control this. Fake news, fake videos, that circulate in the social media and all kinds of things. He says the truly unique feature of our language is not its ability to transmit information, rather it's the ability to transmit information about things that do not exist at all, what we would otherwise call as a myth. So legends, myths, gods and religions appeared for the first time with the cognitive revolution. So this ability to speak about fiction is the most unique feature of the sapiens language, he says. In fact, it is only the human species which has this great ability of imagination. It has a great ability of imagination, and like for example, we can create a man with a lion face, or with a human face and a lion body, which we call as a sphinx. Or a lion-faced and human body is what we call as the Narsimha Avatara. And you have the centaur, isn't it? So all these things, these imaginations are a very unique ability of the human kind. And this imagination makes us do so many things which we would otherwise would not have done it. Even as he said, gods and religions have come out of this imagination. We have created these things out of our own great imaginations, blended some amount of truth and some amount of fiction, some amount of reality and some amount of imagination into things and created. And very interestingly, Yuval Noah Harari says that you could never convince a monkey to give you a banana by promising him limitless bananas after death in the monkey heaven. would you be able to convince a monkey to part with the banana which it has in its hand, saying that if you sacrifice this, you will get limitless bananas in the monkey heaven? But isn't it a fact that we believe in this? We are willing to sacrifice our lives for religions, for gods, whom nobody has actually seen. Nobody really knows whether they exist or not. These are all unverifiable in their own way. So you see, fiction has enabled us not only to merely imagine things from an individual point of view, but collectively millions of people believe in a certain thing as a fact. If you question them, they don't have a real rational answer for it, but still they would say that yes, they believe in it. We can quote across religions such things. We need not pinpoint particular religions or anything. Across religions, all religions have this collective imagination and collective things about things which actually do not exist. They only exist in their imagination. So this is the greatest ability, as I said. Like for example, we have several myths. You see the myths of what we have seen about Midas, who has a golden touch. And then we have the myth of King Arthur's sword called the Excalibur. We have the myths related to great powers, like what great powers like somebody like Ravana had, and how there are stories where they try to, what do you call as, make them invincible. For example, we have heard the story of Achilles' heel, that his mother dips him in a river which would make him completely immune from any weapon. Unfortunately, because she was holding the baby by the feet, the heel did not get drenched in the water of the river, and that became the weak point for him. You know, you can draw a similar parallel to what we have about Duryodhana. Gandhari, his mother, she also blinded herself in some kind of obedience to her blind husband. And just before the war is about to start, she says, I don't know whether you have heard this story, but the story says that he was asked to appear before her naked, so that she would, for once, she would open her eyes and look at him, and he would become invincible. Then Sri Krishna intervenes in the process, and when this fellow is about to walk naked into his mother's chamber, he starts laughing at him and he covers himself up, and his thighs were not exposed to her mother's vision, and they became the weak spot. And that's where Bhima was advised to hit him, and he dies on account of that. You see, these are all stories and myths and legends which are created. I can quote several of these things across religions and across civilizations. But the more important point is, what exactly is this philosopher's stone from a spiritual point of view, from an esoteric point of view? The philosopher's stone is something made out of earth, a stone. And the elixir of life is a liquid, is some kind of water. These two are very important elements for the sustenance of life in evolution. And very importantly, earth and water are more stable and amenable to use them. Unlike air and fire, we do use air and fire, the other two elements also, But it is very difficult to manipulate or play with them unless you develop the skill for it, isn't it? One of the myths that says is the first man who discovered fire was actually burnt in the fire, because people thought he was an evil person. A demon has manifested and created something which people at that time couldn't handle. So the philosopher's stone, from an esoteric point of view, refers to the earth, one of the five important elements, and similarly, the elixir of life refers to water. Now, another symbology that is there in this is earth is considered to be a source of plenty, a source of abundance, a source of wealth. And also it is considered to be as a source of what is called as fecundity. Fecundity is this ability to multiply itself. You know, a species multiplying itself, the ability to reproduce also comes from the symbology of the earth. And life principle comes from water. Most of the historians who have traced the science development of science have said that the first forms of life evolved only after water came into existence. Only after water came into existence, when this earth has substantially cooled down. See, for example, the earth is said to be about 4.3 billion years old. But it cooled down to a substantial degree where it became possible for human evolution only just about 2 million years ago. So the first thing that appeared, they say, is water, whereby unicellular creatures and organisms have come forth, and therefore water is considered to be the source of life. And interestingly, one of the synonyms for the word water in the Sanskrit language is jiva. Jiva itself means life. And one of the synonyms for water is also jiva. So the earth is a symbol of plenty, abundance, wealth, prosperity, and fecundity. And water is a great symbol of life, of the creation of living organisms and the evolutionary process of life, of the life forms on this earth. And another aspect of this is that when you talk about the philosopher's stone, earth as a symbol represents the stability. Stability is a symbol, or is one of the important aspects of the earth. Though we know that the earth is spinning at a very great speed of almost 1600 kilometers per hour, what appears to be stable to us is the earth. We sleep and get up at the same place. We don't sleep somewhere and get up somewhere else. That is the nature of the earth. And humankind has always been interested in things to be stable. We don't like instability. We don't like uncertainty. We are not happy with things changing at a great pace. So from a philosophical point of view or a spiritual point of view, the symbology behind the philosopher's stone, which is a symbol of earth, comes to the quality of stability. But this stability is not something static. This stability has to have something called as dynamism in it, or a dynamic system in it. That is represented by the elixir of life or water, which we call as the fluidity. Fluidity is its ability to flow, its ability to move, its ability to be dynamic in nature. So, as I said, one aspect is the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life. At one level, it represents the two important elements called earth and water. At another level of understanding, they represent plenty and life, abundance and life forms. At the third level, they represent stability and fluidity. And at a psychological level, why do we seek the, why are we so much interested in the philosopher's stone? Why did thousands and thousands of people spend all their lives to discover these things and literally died for it? Why did they die? The important aspect of it is it gives you power. So from a psychological point of view, humankind has always been seeking power in one form or the other. Today also we find that most of us are after wealth, physical, tangible wealth in the form of money or gold or silver or assets or properties, because they give you a sense of power. And we seek that. This is represented by the philosopher's stone. And what is the most important aspect of which the humankind is afraid of? The fear that is built into the system is the fear of death. Now, how to overcome this fear of death? To search for the elixir of life and drink it, so that I become immortal. So, on one end, you seek power, and on the other side, you seek what is called as invincibility or immortality. You see how powerful these symbols can be, how very powerful these symbols can be. From a psychological point of view, you are seeking power and invincibility. Power in some form or the other. Power in the form of wealth, power in the form of, ruling over other human beings and other living creatures. What in other terms, in the modern terms, we call as the political power. And in order to sustain your political power, you need wealth. In spite of all these things, there is a lurking fear in my mind that I am going to die. So what should I do? I should somehow find ways and means to prolong my life, to become immortal. If not immortal, I should indefinitely postpone death. And I should become invincible. I should not die on account of anything. This is the myth of Hiranyakashipu, the demon king who was the father of Prahlada and who was killed by the Narsimhavatara. When he did a lot of penance, and Brahma, the creator, was pleased with him, and he said, I'll give you a boon. And he says, I should not be killed by any weapon. Any known weapon, I should not be killed. I should not be killed inside or outside. I should not be killed during the day or the night. I should not be killed by a human being. I should not be killed by a devata. So whatever he could imagine, he asked for all these boons, all these things, and they were granted. But ultimately, Vishnu had to come in a form where he had to kill him during the twilight, not inside the house and outside the house, but on the border, sitting on the door at the, what you call as the entrance. And he did not use any weapon, known weapon. He used his bare fingernails. his claws. So this invincibility, the people have always been trying for this invincibility and not dying. We find Ravana also saying the same thing. He also wanted to be invincible, and he made a fatal mistake. He never thought that human beings could be a threat to him. So he secured himself in all respects except for asking the boon that he should not be killed by a human being. And Sri Rama had to appear in the form of a human being to kill him. And he had to take the support of monkeys. You see the myths and the legends and the stories that are formed with this. All this is for power and invincibility. We have seen at the physical level how we seek these things, at the psychological level how we seek these things, and when it comes to the spiritual level, what do these two things represent? The philosopher's stone represents purity from a spiritual point. It represents purity. It is something created by burning out all the dross. How do you form gold? When you take the gold in the ore form, you have to do a lot of cleansing, lot of removing waste and purifying it by heating it to a high temperature, where everything else becomes either vapor or ashes, and ultimately you are left with gold. This process symbolizes purity. So from a spiritual point of view, the philosopher's stone symbolizes that process of purification of our own inner nature. That is what we are concerned with. Because, as I said, gold is called as a noble metal. What is noble about it? Because it cannot be easily, it doesn't mix with any of the other metals. It doesn't mix with any of these things. And to create that, you have to heat it to a very high temperature, and then only the purity of it comes about. So the purity which we are talking about as a process actually represents what is called as the sacredness of the being. It is the sacredness in each one of us which is stainless, which is totally pure. Nothing impure can touch it. Nothing impure can ever touch it. See, if you see the commentary of Adi Shankara on the Bhagavad Gita, he very clearly says that all action is only meant for the purification of the self. He says karma is for Atma Shuddhi. So the myth of the philosopher's stone has a very deep spiritual significance, where we have to find that philosopher's stone within ourselves, and that we have to adopt a process of purification whereby we'll be able to touch that core of sacredness which nothing can touch, which nothing impure can ever reach it or touch it. And the second aspect of it is, when you talk about eternity or immortality, from a spiritual point of view, it is actually living in a state of consciousness which is timeless, which is beyond the dimension of time as we know. When we are talking about immortality, the misconception would be about the continuation of the physical body and the world as we know. But it is not that. It's a totally fallacious idea that when somebody talks about immortality, it is not the immortality of the physical body. It is not the immortality about the world and the life and the things you know as you know today. Eternity is to live in a state of timelessness, and it's not about continuity in any form. Because continuity is within the framework of time and space. Continuity is what we understand only from the bodily consciousness part of it. When you are awake in this body, the consciousness functioning through this body, only that level can understand space and time. Suppose you are in a state of deep sleep, there's no space and time, there's no world for you outside there. So we are talking about the elixir of life as being in a state of consciousness which is timeless, which is beyond the purview of space and time. This is the reality of it. This is the reality of it. So there is a necessity to have this myth because it allows you to move from that myth to the reality, from an allegory or a metaphor which is used to metamorphosis or transformation. We have to use the symbol which symbolizes truth, but in order to come to that truth, we have to transcend that symbol. We have to transcend that symbol and then come to it. I would like to just end on a lighter note. You know who is the person who really got the Philosopher's Stone in the recent times, in the 20th century, or even in the 21st century? You know what was the first book of Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling? The first book was Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. A lady who was struggling to survive and bring up her children through this myth by spinning a web of a beautiful story. She has become a multi-billionaire in about a quarter century, in less than a quarter century. So literally she has found the Philosopher's Stone. Each one has that capacity. If we are desperate enough, if we are serious enough, and we have a great idea, and you pursue a dream, ultimately that dream will come true. In fact, for the first edition, I am told she was given only about 10,000 pounds or so. For the first publication of that book called the Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, she got a measly amount of 10,000 pounds. And today, she ranks among one of the richest people, if not the richest in UK. So you see, it is possible to get hold of this Philosopher's Stone, provided you have an idea, provided you have a dream, and provided you are serious, and if you are in search of a spiritual truth, a truth which abides forever, a truth which is timeless, you can find that also, because the Philosopher's Stone and the elixir of life actually, from a different dimension, represent that sacredness and eternity. Thank you so much. I have a few questions here.
Questions, Krishnapani. Yeah.
What is the purpose of mythological stories in our process of evolution? Are they needed at all? Why are we always looking for an alchemy or a quick transformation in our lives? Why are we not content? No, this is a very serious and deep question. But basically, as I said, as I mentioned Yuval Noah Harari, it has been found that humans have this ability to imagine, to dream, and create fiction. These are very much necessary. Because as I mentioned earlier when I was talking also, they are very inspirational. They inspire people. They instigate people. They incite people to do both good and bad actually. Unfortunately, good and bad, and lot of bad also. Whether from the point of view of religion or the gods whom we have created, or the kind of myths and legends we have created, they have sustained civilizations. They have sustained great cultures. Beautiful literature had come about. We have fantastic literature in almost all cultures and civilizations which are actually based on myths. Myths are important because they give you a kind of an inner strength. Stark reality, the mind can really not face things. The mind cannot, is not equipped enough, not trained enough to come in direct contact with stark reality. It always needs a kind of a psychological support, and that is what is provided by these myths and legends. And it is definitely important from the human evolutionary point of view. You find myths sustain a lot of what I would like to call as the whole culture, because it is that our collective ability to believe in something. So they are like that, and when you are, it's not a question of quick transformation also. They wanted a quick solution that way, which could bring about the transformation they were thinking. Lot of alchemical processes are there. In fact, you see, the ancient Indian Ayurveda, they were the first ones to actually find a way of what you call as creating a substance out of mercury, which is in the form of a ash or a powder. Mercury as an element is actually very fluid. You can't hold it, and it has a very high viscosity, and then it has a fluidity of its own. But they have found ways and means to convert it into other forms which are useful for health. And one of the uses of that, it is said in some of the Ayurvedic texts, is that it prolongs life. So alchemical processes are discoveries. You believe in a myth and you invest your time, effort and resource in that. And Jiddu Krishnamurti used to say that when one is really intent on searching for something, I have imagined something in my mind and I'm searching for it, there is always a possibility of finding that something. If not exactly in the form I imagined, but in a closer, nearby form. So they may not have been able to actually discover this elixir of life, but they came slightly closer to it in some form. Like this is common. In Persian they call it as Ab-e Hayat. Hayat means life. Ab is again from the Sanskrit term called Apas. Ab-e Hayat is the elixir of life. And in Makkah and Medina, you have this famous well which gives you Ab-e Zamzam. They say that it has been there for several thousands of years, and it's a panacea kind of thing. It's a cure for everything, and people believe in it. So the basic factor itself is when you say, why are we not content? You are not content because the whole problem is on account of limitation. The mind being fragmentary and always limited, it cannot be content unless it finds a dimension different from itself. Till such dimension is found, by discovering for oneself these spiritual truths, one is bound to be discontent. Discontentment is a good thing in one way. It spurs you to action, to do some action. Contentment from a physical point of view or a mental point of view is a very dangerous thing. One may become totally lethargic and lazy and indolent and useless. Discontent, again, from a spiritual point of view is important because that's what keeps you moving towards that. Some gentleman, I don't know who or he or she is, says seeking power and invincibility are part of the three gunas born out of the ignorance which is timeless. When transcended, knowing its true nature, purity and awareness of reality is absolutely right. You are right, because the very process of manifestation is through limitation. However vast the universe may appear to be, when you consider, when you look at something transcendent, or when by definition what we define as transcendent is infinite and timeless. So manifestation by itself is a limitation, and the first thing we are told, what emerges from Prakriti is Mahat, and what Mahat is based is on the Trigunas, because that is the first differentiation from a Vedantic point of view. That's what, see, they define Maya as Trigunatmika. Maya is a composition of the three gunas. I would not like to go into the Vedantic aspect of it, but it flows from that ignorance. It flows from that, the three gunas which are never to be found in the pure form. They are always found in a very mixed form, with predominance of one or the other at different points of time. And that is what causes this. When they say that this Maya is also Anadi, we have to understand it in a different context. It is cyclical in nature. When you draw a circle, you can't make out where is the beginning, where is the end. So in that form, it is beginning and endless. It is beginningless and endless. But in order to come out of it, you have to move in a direction perpendicular to this direction of this cycle of birth and death and the Maya which goes on. So the statement is very much correct. So unless we transcend this ignorance, we will not be able to come to understand or come to realize the sacredness and the immortality or the timelessness of that dimension. I hope things have been, I could make some sense in pointing out the levels of this myths and levels of reality pertaining to these things, which are important from a human psychology point of view also, because that is what drives us to greater and greater achievement and greater attainment of that purity, and realizing that there is this timeless dimension to it.
Okay.
So
thank you so much. Thank you so much, Krishnapani ji. As always, very informative and very, very inspiring. Thank you so much. So for everybody who's here, next week we have another great program for you on 13th May. And please note, this is a Saturday at 7 p.m. We have Sri Ishwaran ji, who's going to talk to us on the fragrance of forgiveness. So you all know Ishwaran ji, so I don't have to tell you anything about him. So please be there next week, 13th May at 7 p.m. Thank you all for your presence and participation today from all of us at Ritambara. And with that, we will conclude today's session. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Krishnapani ji.